Welcome and good morning. Thank you for joining us today at what will be an excellent conference for all of those interested in the financial industry impacts and aspects of cannabis. Cannabis, CBD, and excuse me. Trying to advance my slides here. Here we go. So cannabis, CBD, and hemp are very much on everyone's minds these days in the US as we grapple with the introduction of legalization at the state level and at the federal level for some or all of these products. And those of us in the financial services industry are particularly interested in the latest developments in this area. And we want to thank the team at MPC for putting together a special conference today, WeedTech US 2021. With the conference today, we are focused on the financial impacts of cannabis payments and all of the financial services issues associated with it. We'll look at the regulatory and compliance guidelines and the impacts for point of sale technology as we transition in the world of cannabis in the US. I want to make a special point of thanking Marla Elliman and Dale Lassick and Shiloh Lassen for putting together a great panel session today with excellent coverage of the legalization and business aspects in the financial services industry with respect to cannabis, CBD, and hemp. This is an important virtual event, and it's a unique event, one of a kind. And there are a few subjects today that are more topical or dynamic than this, especially as we face the stark dichotomy between the federal and state regulatory treatment of cannabis in the US. Even at the 40,000-foot level, this is a very complex and evolving subject. But I will try to give you a basic background today of the subject matter from my perspective. And let me emphasize, this is my presentation. This is not a formal presentation on behalf of the National ATM Council. I do serve as executive director of the council, and they are certainly very interested in these issues, but this is my presentation today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started and dive into the subject at hand. As you can see from the first slide, we're looking at a situation in the US today where the cannabis industry has become a huge part of our economy and a growing part of our economy. There's clearly major momentum toward legalization of cannabis in the US, but as we sit here today, cannabis remains a federal crime. Even though cannabis has been approved at the state level in many jurisdictions, in fact, in most jurisdictions, in some shape or form, cannabis still sits on the federal Schedule I prohibited substances list. And this is an industry that has now surpassed wine sales in the US and is adding tens of thousands of new jobs and dollars to the economy. So clearly something needs to be done. So what's the actual dilemma from the financial service sector perspective? Well, we just covered it. It's currently a federal crime to engage in cannabis activities, subject to up to a year in prison and a minimum of $1,000 fine. And this disconnect has created a very difficult limbo situation for everybody concerned. This includes cannabis providers, suppliers to the cannabis industry, and especially for our focus today, the banks, credit unions, and other financial service providers. Unfortunately, this dichotomy, and I've seen it happen in other industries, creates a situation that can really bring about perverse circumstances. It invites crime, it can reward illicit behavior, and ultimately it increases prices to consumers needlessly. So what's been happening in the banking world with respect to cannabis? And excuse me, as this chart shows, the numbers have been dropping, surprisingly, as cannabis has been emerging with more and more legalization in states. Fewer and fewer banks over recent years are banking cannabis companies. And here's the breakdown between the banks and credit unions that are servicing the industry currently, at least as of March of this year. And you can see together there's 684 institutions currently serving the industry. And this is taken from the suspicious activity reports filed with FinCEN. This is about the best data out there that I have found. But this situation has left us in a position where many banks are unwilling to bank the industry. And as a result, we're looking at a tremendous amount of cash involved with this industry, and cash that cannot easily be translated into electronic currency and put into the banking system. And the questions come about as to how you account for the cash, how do you store it safely, how do you transport it? I've heard anecdotally of situations where people are sitting literally with millions of dollars in cash in a warehouse in a legalized state, and they cannot get it into the banking system. Certainly cannot do so easily. So this is a problem, as the slide points out. There have been tremendous amounts of crimes associated with this situation. The criminals know there's cash available to be had in these dispensaries, and it's resulted in some pretty terrible attacks and places dispensary workers, people who service the dispensaries, including in an area I'm familiar with, the ATM industry. It places people at risk needlessly. So how do things look currently in DC with respect to cannabis legalization and bringing about some rationality to the legal and regulatory system currently in place as between the federal and state governments in this country? There's substantial legislation currently pending in Congress. First here, we covered the SAFE Act, and that bill has now been passed 4 times by the House of Representatives, which really shows you what the picture is here, that you've got strong support, and this includes both Democratic and a decent amount of Republican support in the House. This has been passed as recently as this past April. And this bill focuses primarily on providing a safe harbor for banks and other vendor suppliers to the cannabis industry to allow them to do that in a legal fashion. So it doesn't legalize cannabis or do anything else really with respect to cannabis, other than to say that the federal criminal system will not prosecute banks and other vendors for dealing with cannabis providers or suppliers. This has a lot of support. You can see it's passed the House widely, and it has 39 co-sponsors in the Senate, which is huge. However, as we'll discuss more in a minute, it's run into opposition from Senate leadership, who favor a more comprehensive piece of legislation. The next bill pending in Congress right now is the States Act. And this really shows the importance that Congress is willing to place with the states in terms of implementing and regulating cannabis throughout the country. Federal government recognizes that the states are well along the way in this process, and they don't want to have to reinvent the wheel or step on any toes needlessly. This bill really, I think, is viewed as very unlikely to go anywhere at this time. It makes it very tough on banks and others to properly implement the legislation in a safe fashion. There's also the MORE Act, which is another piece of legislation that's been introduced and gotten great response in the House, and has sponsorship in the Senate, including from now Vice President Kamala Harris, when she was a senator. This bill does remove cannabis from the controlled substances list, and it provides retroactive criminal expungement. So, past criminal records would be expunged and eliminated under this, and that's viewed as a social equity provision associated with what's viewed as discriminatory past application and enforcement of these laws. The bill, however, lacks some key provisions addressing how this would work vis-a-vis federal regulation and tax treatment, but it does have the support of the Cannabis Trade Federation, which switched its earlier support from the state's legislation over to the MORE Act. It passed the House last December, again this April, but it does leave significant questions open for compliance. And again, it's not viewed as the likely vehicle to pass, but it does show the importance Congress places on the state's role. So the latest and greatest development in this area in Congress involves the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. This was introduced a short time ago, a little over a month ago, by Senators Cory Booker and Ron Wyden, and also notably Senate Leader Schumer. So this is a very serious piece of legislation to come in the Senate. It certainly is a great sign that there is a serious willingness, at least among the Democratic leadership in the Senate, to consider comprehensive marijuana legalization legislation. It removes marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, and it begins federal regulation and taxation of these businesses. There is a lot of deference in the bill to the states, but it clearly removes any federal prosecution cloud, and it contains those social equity provisions with respect to the way these laws are implemented at the state level, and to try to assure that that's done in a fair and non-discriminatory manner, and in a manner that recognizes what are perceived to be past injustices. The regulators under this bill will be the FDA and the Treasury Department's alcohol and tobacco tax. And I'm sorry, I just had difficulty reading that last provision there. In any event, it's the Treasury and FDA that will regulate under this bill. And it does provide full access to banking services for these businesses and access as well to tax deductions associated with business activities in this area. So it's a great leap forward, However, it does face an uphill battle in the Senate with significant Republican opposition. There have been opponents already to the bill that have voiced some significant concerns, and it's unclear how those can be resolved. There's also some question as to what President Biden would do with such a law if it were passed by Congress. The president is on record favoring decriminalization of marijuana, but not necessarily legalization. We do have that earlier, Moore bill that had the support of Kamala Harris, so it's possible that that position could soften if, legalization legislation did emerge from Congress. Notably, this act has been put forward as a draft bill, so there's an opportunity to file comments by September 1st to the proposals in the legislation. So if you have something to say, now's the time to say it, and it will be considered in the process. So it's worth the effort. Okay, let me try to get my slide to advance here. So the other things happening in Congress, most recently, the House just recently approved a minibus bill as opposed to an omnibus appropriations bill. It's a spending bill, and they did take the opportunity to put language in the bill that says these funds cannot be used to penalize banks or credit unions solely for providing financial services to cannabis businesses. This is not as robust a piece of legislation as the SAFE Act, but it does again demonstrate a significant focus on the Hill generally to these issues and to doing something to move things forward in this area. On the flip side, a recent pressure that's been put on Sherrod Brown, who chairs the Senate Banking Committee, to take the SAFE Act, which is that safe harbor bill, to a markup quickly, was rebuffed by Sherrod Brown, and it's at odds with the bill that's been introduced by Senate President Schumer, Senate Leader Schumer, excuse me. So there is this tension now between Congress doing something to provide safe harbor to financial service providers and other vendors to the industry, the cannabis industry, versus a more significant reform act that appears to be preferred strongly by Senate leadership. So that has to be worked through ultimately for a resolution of the issues to be reached in this area. Either of those actions would be a positive step forward for the industry, but as is often the case in Congress, the differing positions such as this can cause significant delay before action is actually taken. So the timing remains open. So in this sort of limbo that we're in, where cannabis activities are illegal at the federal level, but are allowed in virtually all states now in some form, it's a very difficult situation for all involved. As an attorney, I can also say that it presents difficulties even for lawyers to properly advise their clients in this area, because of the risk that exists from the current federal laws on the books. And the policy implementation of those laws has been shown to be able to change on a dime based upon, who's in office. And a new memo can come out literally at any time from the Justice Department that can change the equation with respect to the enforcement activities in this area, or the lack of them at the federal level. As a practical matter, there certainly seems to be a great level of deference from the federal to the state level. But again, it's an uncertain situation that presents difficulties and challenges for all involved. So how does this work today? Well, the most prevalent current payment vehicle today is the placement of an ATM at a dispensary. Initially, we saw ATMs placed near dispensaries, adjacent to dispensaries, in certain areas of the property that were designated as non-dispensary areas, and a variety of other strategies to be able to place ATMs in and around dispensaries in a lawful manner. This is simply because many customers at dispensaries prefer to pay in cash, number one. And number two, this has been a real problem in terms of acceptance of payment at dispensaries using credit or debit cards. And this is because the global networks and all of the banks that operate in compliance with the network rules have taken the position that the federal status of cannabis being illegal prevents them from allowing transactions, financial transactions, to proceed with respect to cannabis. And so that, plus the general tendency of cannabis customers to want to pay in cash, has led to a tremendous reliance upon cash in the business. And that, of course, has led to the need for ATMs as cash dispensing terminals. And so with the strong marketplace demand for ATMs at dispensaries, those have been placed in proximity to dispensaries. And now, thankfully, they are being placed lawfully in dispensaries pursuant to new programs that are recently rolled out by the sponsoring banks that sponsor ATM operators and independent ATM deployments. And those programs now provide for entirely above board lawful placement of ATMs at dispensaries, which is certainly a great step forward. At the same time, this is new, and there are some issues and questions to be resolved. One that has just come to my attention involves the need, at least under one bank's rules, to have separate accounts for terminals involved with cannabis activities versus all other terminals. And while this certainly sounds reasonable and on the face of it can make some sense, it presents significant issues with respect to the manner in which you can actually operate, and it's presenting issues for operators, for cash loaders, and others to actually operate in this manner. So there appears to be some work to be done there, and I'm sure there are other issues, but at least we do now have fully lawful above board programs that are allowing placement of ATMs in conjunction with dispensaries, even with the current technical federal penalty ban in place. This has also led, though, to a real sore spot and an issue in the industry that NAC has put out a bulletin on and alert to the industry on, and many have expressed great concern about, and that's with respect to the cashless ATMs, so-called cashless ATMs. And what those are terminals that are point of sale terminals that have been programmed to send out transactions in the form of ATM transactions. And this has been held to violate network rules, and it presents an issue in terms of being classified as money laundering by FinCEN. And it's really a problem. The rules can provide for up to $50,000 in fines per violation. This can implicate the merchants as well as the providers. And but it's enough of a gray area, and this limbo that we're all in has created this scenario where there have been this deployment of cashless ATMs. As I understand it, there has been more and more and will be more enforcement and auditing in the field. And so if you're involved with this, you really need to take a hard look, talk to your attorney, and make sure you're in solid shape, even the merchants are in good shape. There are a couple of other mechanisms that have evolved as well. PayQuick, which gets into a detailed compliance handling and basically has you prepay funds, holds the funds until they are cleared from a compliance perspective, and then releases the funds accordingly. The Dama financial solution also has the ability to bank these transactions in a meaningful way. It does involve an intensive application process and other aspects to the implementation. But these are the current vehicles that we're aware of. So getting to the conclusion here, it's notable that the ABA has come out in support of federal regulation and legislation to bring greater certainty here. And I think that's a significant driver now for Congress and the regulators to act. Amazon has also publicly stated its support for federal legalization, and hopefully has and will be devoting some lobbying resources to that. And certainly Amazon taking an active role in support of this will help move the needle as well. At the state level, we've seen California recently adopt legislation that does provide a safe harbor for California chartered banks and suppliers to the cannabis industry, and it entails waivers that allow the sharing of their information from the state level to the federal level to help provide greater comfort and security to the banks in the handling of these accounts. So that is helpful. And in the wake of the passage of the Farm Bill of 2018, that legalized hemp, there was a very helpful set of guidance issued from the NCUA that regulates the credit unions. And that, I think, has really helped in that area to guide and bring comfort to the financial industry. And I'm hopeful that something like that can come about with respect to cannabis. But in all likelihood, it will require the passage of federal law and the elimination of cannabis from the Schedule I list. And hopefully that things are lined up for that to happen. As I hope I've pointed out to you adequately, there are still some steps to go, but we're getting closer, I think, to the goal line of a much better situation. And as noted at the end there, the bottom line here is, I think America's citizens, the financial institution and financial industry, and the licensed cannabis industry all deserve a rational, coherent, and coordinated legal and regulatory framework in which to do business, in which to live. And so hopefully we are getting there, and we're not too far away from having that environment in which to operate and live. And thank MPC and the WeTech US 2021 staff for allowing me the honor and opportunity to introduce the program today. And there is an excellent program that they've put together for you. And I hope everyone will catch all of the sessions today and get a lot out of them in terms of how best to navigate these choppy waters in the cannabis world and in the financial services world. If you do have any questions for me, please feel free to submit those either in the chat function or contact me directly, and I'll be happy to help. So thank you so much for your attendance and participation today. And I will now turn things back over to NPC and WeTech US 2021 to carry us forward into today's program. Thank you again for this opportunity.